there is a moment that happens before any word is spoken. Two people enter a room together, and before either has said a single sentence, something has already been decided between them. Something ancient, wordless, and almost entirely invisible to the conscious mind. One of them will, in some small or significant way, bend the shape of the conversation. The other will follow it. This happens constantly, in boardrooms and living rooms, in first dates and hostage negotiations, in classrooms and quiet family dinners, and almost no one involved could tell you why it happened or how it was decided. Power is often imagined as something loud. A title on a door, a raised voice, a hand slammed on a table. But the power that actually governs human relationships, the power that determines who gets listened to, who gets believed, who gets followed and who gets overlooked, rarely announces itself. It moves beneath language. It operates through posture, through timing, through the almost imperceptible calculations the human mind makes about who deserves deference and who does not. And the truly unsettling part is that these calculations are happening inside you right now, in every relationship you hold, whether you have ever examined them or not. This is a book about the rules nobody hands you, not the formal rules of leadership seminars or corporate training manuals, but the older, deeper architecture beneath them. The psychological code that determined who held influence in a hunting party 50,000 years ago and still determines, with startling precision, who holds influence in a meeting on Tuesday morning. These rules were never written down because for most of human history they did not need to be. Everyone could feel them. Only in a world grown large and complex and mediated through screens have they become invisible enough to require excavation. What follows are 14 principles, drawn from psychology, from history, from the quiet observation of how status actually moves between people. Some will confirm what you already suspected but never had language for. Others will unsettle you because they reveal how much of what you believed was earned was in fact granted, and how much of what you believed was fixed was in fact negotiable all along. This is not a book about domination. It is a book about clarity, about finally seeing the current that has been moving beneath every interaction of your life. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And once you cannot unsee it, you can never again be moved by it without your own consent. Law 1. The law of the unclaimed room. There is a particular kind of silence that exists in the first 4 seconds after someone enters a room. And almost no one notices it, because almost no one has been taught to listen for it. It is not the silence of nothing happening. It is the silence of a great deal happening very quickly, all of it beneath the threshold of conscious speech. Every person already present performs, in that silence, a rapid and largely involuntary calculation. Who is this? What do they want? Where do they belong in relation to me? And most critically, though almost never phrased this way, even in the privacy of one's own mind, do I need to adjust my behavior because of their arrival? Or can I continue exactly as I was? This is the law of the unclaimed room, and it states a truth that most people spend their entire lives instinctively sensing, but never articulating. Every room, every gathering, every shared physical or conversational space carries within it an unclaimed quantity of status. Not fixed status, not the status printed on a business card or listed in an org chart, but a living, moment-to-moment status that is available to be claimed by whoever enters it with the right bearing. And the person who claims it is very often not the person with the most formal authority. It is the person whose arrival changes the temperature of the room without asking permission to do so. Consider what actually happens when 2 categories of person walk into an identical space. The first enters scanning. Their eyes move quickly across the room, searching for cues, searching for where they are meant to sit, whom they are meant to greet first, whether their presence has been noticed and approved of. Their pace quickens very slightly, an almost imperceptible acceleration that communicates urgency, and urgency, however subtle, is read by every nervous system present as a kind of appeal. It says, without a single word being spoken, please have a place for me here. The second person enters differently. Their pace does not change because the room did not require them to change it. Their eyes move, but without the searching quality, more the way a person looks at a space they already consider familiar territory. They do not scan for approval. They simply arrive, and the room, sensing the absence of appeal, extends a kind of deference it did not consciously choose to extend. This is not a matter of confidence in the vague, motivational sense the word usually carries. It is a matter of information. The room is constantly gathering information about how much this person needs it, and the amount of need on display is inversely related to the amount of status that will be spontaneously conferred. This is uncomfortable to hear because it feels unjust. Surely status should be a function of competence, of contribution, of genuine merit accumulated over years. And in the long run, over the arc of a career or a relationship, this is largely true. But in the first 4 seconds, before any competence has been demonstrated, before any word has been spoken, the room does not yet have access to your merit. It only has access to your bearing. And bearing, in that narrow window, is doing all of the work that reputation will eventually do. The failure most people make in this opening test is not a failure of character. It is a failure of awareness. They have never been told that the room is testing them, and so they walk in exactly as they feel, which is very often slightly anxious, slightly uncertain of their welcome, slightly too eager to locate the friendly face that will make the space feel safe. None of this is a flaw. It is simply unexamined. The correction is not to manufacture false confidence, which the room detects with remarkable speed and punishes more severely than honest uncertainty. The correction is slower and more durable. It is the cultivation, well before you ever cross a threshold, of a genuine relationship with your own right to occupy space. The person who has done this internal work does not perform ease when entering a room. They simply have not left it behind. And the room, sensing the difference between performance and genuine possession, responds to the second with a deference the first can never quite manufacture. The practical implication is this. Before you walk into any room that matters, pause, take the breath, let your pace settle to something that belongs to you, rather than to the anxiety of the threshold. The room has already decided to test you. The only question that remains is whether you will meet that test having prepared, or having simply hoped. Law 2. The law of withheld reaction. There is a specific moment in every negotiation, every disagreement, every delicate exchange between two people who want something from each other, when one party's face changes first. A flicker of hope, a widening of the eyes, a small, almost involuntary lean forward. And in that moment, something has been given away that can never quite be retrieved. Not the outcome itself, not yet, but the information the other party needed most. The information of who wants this more. This is the law of withheld reaction, and it rests on a psychological mechanism so old and so reliable that it operates in negotiations over corporate contracts with precisely the same force it operates in a child's request for a later bedtime. Visible need is read, almost universally and almost instantly, as a shift in leverage. The moment your face announces how much you want something, you have handed the other party a form of power over you that no amount of subsequent argument can fully recover. They now know the price of your comfort. They know how long they can wait you out. They know, with a certainty that no words could have given them as efficiently, exactly how much room they have to ask for more. This does not mean that emotion itself is a liability. Genuine emotion, expressed at the moment of your own choosing rather than leaking out involuntarily at the moment of maximum vulnerability, remains one of the most powerful tools of connection available to any human being. The distinction that matters here is not between feeling and not feeling. It is between the reaction that escapes you and the response you choose. The first person in any exchange to lose this distinction, to let the reaction escape before the response has been considered, is very often the first person to lose ground in that exchange, regardless of the actual merits of their position. Watch closely the next time you observe two people negotiating anything, whether it is a salary, a price, or simply whose preference will govern where to eat dinner. The person who maintains what might be called a level face, not a blank or cold face, but a face that has simply declined to broadcast its internal weather tends over time to receive better terms than the person whose every internal shift plays out visibly across their features. This is not because the level-faced person is more intelligent or more deserving. It is because they have not yet handed over the specific piece of information that the other party would use, consciously or not, to calibrate exactly how much pressure to apply. There is a deeper layer here worth sitting with, because it explains why this law is so difficult to practice, even once understood intellectually. The withholding of visible reaction is often mistaken for suppression, and suppression, as anyone who has tried it knows, is exhausting and ultimately visible in its own right. The tightened jaw, the too still posture, the voice held at an unnatural evenness. These are not the marks of composure. They are the marks of a person working very hard to appear composed, and the effort itself becomes a signal almost as legible as the reaction it was meant to conceal. Genuine composure is not the suppression of feeling. It is the separation of feeling from its immediate expression, achieved not through force of will in the moment, but through a prior relationship with the emotion in question. The negotiator who has already made peace, hours or days before the meeting, with the possibility of walking away without the outcome they wanted, does not need to suppress anything in the room. They have already done the internal work that makes the reaction unnecessary rather than merely hidden. This is the practical heart of the law. Composure under pressure is not a performance skill to be executed in the moment of pressure itself. It is the visible residue of preparation that happened long before the room was entered. The person who wants to master this law is not looking for a better poker face. They are looking for a genuine internal position from which very little in any single exchange feels urgent enough to leak through the features uninvited. Build that position first. The face will follow it naturally, and the room will read the difference without ever being able to say precisely what it noticed. Law 3. The law of the long pause. Most people experience silence in a conversation as a problem to be solved. The moment a pause extends even slightly beyond what feels comfortable, an almost physical pressure builds behind the sternum. A pressure that says, fill this, say something, anything, before the silence becomes evidence of a failure somewhere. This pressure is so universal, so deeply wired into the social nervous system, that an entire dimension of interpersonal power sits almost entirely unclaimed, simply because so few people are willing to tolerate the discomfort required to claim it. This is the law of the long pause, and it states something counterintuitive enough that it bears repeating plainly. Silence, in any exchange between two people, is not empty space waiting to be filled. It is a pressure system, actively distributed between the parties present, and the person who can remain inside it longest, without breaking, almost always gains something the other person did not intend to give away. Consider the mechanics of what actually happens when a pause extends. The party who breaks it first is very often not breaking it because they have something important to add. They are breaking it because the pressure of the unfilled space has become greater than their tolerance for holding it. And in the act of breaking it, they frequently say more than they intended, offer a concession that was not yet necessary, or ask a question that reveals uncertainty they had been trying to conceal. The silence did not extract this information through any active technique. It simply waited, and the human tendency to fill discomfort with words did the rest of the work. This mechanism is why skilled negotiators, skilled interviewers, and skilled listeners of every kind share a trait that appears almost identical across otherwise very different personalities. They have made a genuine peace with the pause. Not a performed peace, not a technique deployed while internally counting the seconds and gritting their teeth against the urge to speak, but an actual comfort with the idea that silence between two people is not evidence that something has gone wrong. It is simply a space in which thought is occurring, and thought, properly given room, tends to produce something more honest than the reflexive words that rush in to avoid discomfort. There is a second application of this law that matters as much as the first, and it concerns what happens after you have said something significant. Most people, having delivered a meaningful statement, an offer, an apology, a difficult truth, immediately begin qualifying it. They soften it, explain it, add caveats, ask if that makes sense, essentially chase their own words with reassurance, because the silence that follows a significant statement feels, in the moment, unbearable. But this chasing very often undoes the power of what was just said. The statement that is allowed to simply land, followed by genuine silence rather than anxious qualification, carries a weight that the same statement immediately hedged can never carry. The silence after the significant word is doing work. It is giving the listener room to actually absorb what was said, rather than being swept along to the next sentence before the first has finished registering. Learning to tolerate this pressure is not a matter of technique in the shallow sense. Though there are small physical practices that help, such as consciously allowing one full breath to pass before responding to any question that matters. The deeper work is the same internal work described in the law before this one. A person who is not managing an undercurrent of anxiety about whether they are being liked, whether the silence means disapproval, whether they need to prove something in this exact moment, finds the long pause considerably easier to inhabit, because for them it genuinely is not evidence of anything gone wrong. It is simply the shape the conversation is currently taking. Cultivate that internal ease, and the long pause stops being a test you must pass through gritted teeth and becomes, quite naturally, one of the most reliable instruments of influence available to you. Law 4. The law of selective access. There is a particular kind of erosion that happens to anything or anyone that becomes universally and immediately available. It is not a dramatic erosion. It does not announce itself with any single moment of loss. It simply accumulates, quietly, until one day the thing that was once sought after has become the thing that is merely used, and the person who was once valued has become the person who is merely relied upon. This is the law of selective access, and it governs the value of your time, your attention, and your presence, with a consistency that very few people ever examine directly. The underlying mechanism is not mysterious once named. Human beings calculate value, in large part, through the lens of effort and scarcity. The thing that requires effort to obtain feels, by the very fact of that effort, more valuable than the thing that requires none, even when the two things are functionally identical. This is not a flaw in human reasoning to be corrected. It is a deep and largely accurate heuristic, because in the environments in which human psychology evolved, the things worth expending effort to protect and to seek generally were more valuable than the things freely available on every side. The heuristic has simply outlived some of the contexts in which it originally applied, and continues operating with full force in contexts, such as personal relationships and professional standing, where it produces effects that are easy to overlook. Apply this to the ordinary texture of a life. The colleague who responds to every message within minutes, at any hour, regardless of the significance of the request, trains everyone around them to expect that speed as the baseline, and baseline expectations, once established, generate no gratitude when met, and considerable irritation when violated. The friend who is always available, who never has a prior commitment, who will rearrange their schedule at a moment's notice for nearly any request, becomes over time a kind of fixture, rather than a presence actively chosen. Their company stops being something looked forward to and starts being something assumed. This is not because the friend has become less generous or less interesting. It is because the structural condition of scarcity, which had been quietly doing work in the background of how they were valued, has been removed, and nothing has replaced it. The correction here requires care, because the law of selective access is trivially easy to misapply into something cold or performative, and performed unavailability is detected by others with almost the same speed as performed confidence, producing resentment rather than the intended effect. The genuine version of this law is not about manufacturing scarcity through games, through deliberately slow responses calculated for effect, through a coldness designed purely to be noticed. It is about the more difficult and more honest work of actually having a full life, genuinely populated with your own commitments, projects, and standards for how your time is spent, such that your availability to any single person or request is a real and not a theatrical constraint. This distinction matters enormously in practice. The person who has cultivated a genuinely full life does not need to calculate when to seem busy. They simply are engaged elsewhere in ways that are real, and when they do make time for someone, that time carries a weight it would not carry if it was simply the default condition of an empty calendar. The gift of their attention means something because it was, in fact, chosen from among other genuine claims on it, rather than offered by default because nothing else was competing for the space. There is a further layer worth naming plainly. Selective access is not only about time. It applies with equal force to information, to opinion, and to emotional openness. The person who shares every thought the moment it occurs to them, who holds nothing back, who is an open book in every conversation, regardless of the depth of the relationship, finds that their disclosures carry less weight over time, precisely because disclosure has become the ambient condition rather than the exception. The person who is more measured, who reserves genuine depth for the relationships and moments that have earned it, finds that when they do open up, the moment lands with a gravity that constant openness could never produce. This is not an argument for secrecy or coldness. It is an argument for intentionality, for recognizing that what is freely and constantly given, however genuine, tends to be received as less precious than what has been reserved and then offered. Law 5. The law of the borrowed frame. Every conversation, every disagreement, every shared decision takes place inside an invisible structure that determines, often before a single substantive word has been exchanged, what the conversation is actually about. This structure is called a frame, and the person who establishes it first, whether deliberately or entirely by accident, exercises a form of influence over everything that follows that is considerably more powerful than any individual argument made once the frame is already in place. This is the law of the borrowed frame, and its central danger lies precisely in how invisible it typically is to the person who has unconsciously accepted someone else's version of reality as the natural and only way to see the situation at hand. Consider a simple domestic example, one stripped of any dramatic stakes so that the mechanism can be seen clearly. A conversation about whether to spend money on a particular purchase can be framed, from its very first sentence, as a conversation about affordability, in which case every subsequent argument will orbit around numbers, budgets, and constraint. Or it can be framed as a conversation about priorities, in which case the same numbers become secondary to questions of what actually matters to the people involved. The facts under discussion have not changed at all between these two framings. What has changed is which facts are treated as relevant, which questions are treated as the real ones, and which considerations are quietly excluded from the conversation before anyone consciously decided to exclude them. The person who speaks first in any significant exchange has an outsized opportunity to set this frame, and the person who receives that framing without examining it has, in a very real sense, already conceded a great deal of the conversation's outcome before their own position has even been stated. This is not because the first speaker is more persuasive in the moment. It is because frames operate beneath the level of the arguments made within them. Arguing skillfully inside a frame that does not serve you is still losing because the frame itself has already determined which of your possible arguments are even considered relevant to raise. Learning to recognize when you have accepted a borrowed frame requires a specific kind of attention, because the sensation of having accepted one does not feel like submission. It feels like simply engaging with the actual substance of a situation. The signal to watch for is more subtle. It is the sense, often only detectable in retrospect, that you have found yourself defending a position within terms you did not choose and would not have chosen if you had paused to consider the framing itself before responding to its content. If you notice, hours after a difficult conversation, a nagging feeling that something about the terms of the discussion never quite sat right with you, even though you could not, in the moment, name what was wrong. You have very likely experienced the law of the borrowed frame operating on you without your awareness. The corrective practice is neither combative nor complicated, though it does require a discipline most people have never developed, which is the habit of pausing before responding to the content of a claim in order to first notice its frame. Before answering the question you have been asked, silently ask a prior question. What definition of the situation is this question assuming? What is being treated as the obvious starting point that might in fact deserve examination? This single habit, practiced consistently, changes the entire texture of how a person moves through disagreement, because it restores the option, previously invisible, of responding not only to the content offered, but to the frame that content arrived inside. There is a constructive version of this law as well, one that moves beyond mere defense into genuine contribution. The person who has learned to notice frames does not only protect themselves from borrowed ones, they develop the far rarer capacity to offer better frames of their own, gently and without announcement, simply by being the person in the room who names, with clarity, what the conversation is actually about before anyone else has done so. This is not manipulation when done honestly, because an honest reframe does not distort the facts under discussion. It simply proposes openly and in good faith that a different and perhaps more useful lens might be applied to the same shared reality. The person who can do this consistently finds that conversations tend, over time, to organize themselves around the questions they consider important, not through force, but through the quiet and cumulative authority of having reliably offered the frame that made the most sense. Law 6. The law of the quiet certainty. There is a particular sound that confidence makes when it is genuine, and it is, somewhat counterintuitively, closer to silence than to volume. Most people, when asked to picture someone powerful, picture someone loud, the voice that fills the room, the opinion delivered with force, the certainty that brooks no interruption. And yet observe closely the people whose word actually carries the most weight in any given room, the people whose opinion is sought rather than merely offered, and a different pattern tends to emerge. They speak less, they speak more slowly, and the volume at which they deliver even their most firmly held convictions is very often lower, not higher, than the volume used by those around them who are working harder to be believed. This is the law of the quiet certainty, and it rests on a distinction that is easy to state, but genuinely difficult to internalize. Loud confidence, the kind that fills a room with volume and speed, and the relentless assertion of a position, is very often not confidence at all in its deepest sense. It is frequently the sound of doubt being actively managed in real time, a performance mounted, often without full conscious awareness on the part of the performer, precisely because some part of the speaker suspects that the position will not survive quiet, unhurried scrutiny, and must therefore be pushed through with enough force and speed to avoid that scrutiny altogether. Genuine certainty, the kind built on a settled internal relationship with one's own judgment, does not require this kind of propulsion. It does not need to convince the room of its own validity through sheer volume, because it is not, at its root, seeking the room's validation in the first place. The social brain remarkably detects this difference with more accuracy than most people give it credit for, even when it cannot articulate what it has detected. There is something in sustained, unhurried, unelevated speech that reads, almost universally, as a signal that the speaker is not afraid of being questioned, precisely because they have already done the internal questioning themselves, thoroughly, before arriving at the room. Loud insistence, by contrast, often triggers a subtle skepticism in listeners even when they cannot name its source. A quiet sense that the volume is compensating for something the words alone are not quite achieving. This has significant practical implications for anyone who wishes to be genuinely persuasive rather than merely audible. The instinct, when facing resistance or disagreement, is almost always to increase intensity, to speak faster, louder, with more visible conviction, as though the resistance can be overwhelmed through sheer force of delivery. This instinct is usually counterproductive. Resistance met with escalating intensity tends to escalate in return, precisely because the intensity itself is read as pressure, and pressure, as explored elsewhere in this book, reliably produces its own equal and opposite reaction. The quieter path, the path of slowing down rather than speeding up when met with resistance, of lowering the voice rather than raising it, of allowing a considered pause before responding rather than rushing to overcome the objection, tends paradoxically to produce far less resistance in return, because it does not read as an attempt at domination. It reads as the settled confidence of someone who does not need the listener's immediate agreement in order to remain secure in their own position. Cultivating this quality is not primarily a matter of vocal technique, though vocal technique plays some role. It is, more fundamentally, a matter of the same internal work discussed throughout this book, the genuine reduction of one's own need for the room's approval. The person who has done this work does not need to perform certainty, because they are no longer frightened by the possibility of disagreement. Disagreement, to a person with a settled relationship to their own judgment, is simply information to be considered, not a threat to be defeated through volume. And it is precisely this absence of threat response, visible in the unhurried quality of the voice and the willingness to leave space after a statement, rather than immediately defending it, that produces the effect the loud performance of confidence has always been chasing and has always, in the end, fallen short of achieving. Law 7. The law of strategic deference. There is a mistake, common enough to deserve its own careful examination, in which a person comes to believe that power is best demonstrated through the accumulation of small victories. Every disagreement won, every preference asserted and honored, every minor point defended to its conclusion. This person moves through their relationships and their professional life, collecting these small wins with a kind of quiet satisfaction, unaware that each one, however minor, is quietly spending down a resource considerably more valuable than the thing being won. This is the law of strategic deference, and it begins with a recognition that runs against the grain of how most people instinctively think about influence. In any relationship that will continue over time, whether professional, familial, or intimate, the accumulated goodwill of the other party is a resource of extraordinary value, and every visible insistence on being right about something small draws down that resource in ways that are rarely felt in the moment but accumulate with real consequence over the life of the relationship. The person who has never once yielded a minor point, who must win every small exchange, is not building a reputation for strength. They are building, without quite realizing it, a reputation for someone whose relationships are structured around contest rather than collaboration. And that reputation, once established, becomes a genuine liability at precisely the moment it matters most. The strategic use of deference begins with a simple discipline, the willingness to distinguish clearly between the disagreements that genuinely matter and the disagreements that do not, and to apply an entirely different standard of engagement to each. Most disagreements, examined honestly, fall into the second category: the choice of restaurant, the precise wording of an email that will be read once and forgotten, the minor procedural preference in a meeting that has no bearing on the outcome anyone actually cares about. These are the disagreements in which visible, gracious yielding costs almost nothing in real terms, and yet is registered by the person on the receiving end as a genuine and memorable act of consideration. Yielding here is not weakness. It is the deliberate and inexpensive purchase of goodwill that will matter considerably more later than the minor point being surrendered matters now. The genuine skill in this law lies in the honest identification of which category a given disagreement belongs to, because the temptation is always present to convince oneself that every disagreement is, in fact, one of the important ones, precisely because being right feels good in the moment, regardless of the actual stakes involved. The person who has mastered this law has developed the capacity to ask, quickly and honestly, Before investing energy in defending a position, whether the position genuinely matters to an outcome they care about, or whether the desire to defend it is simply the reflexive pull of wanting to be seen as correct. This is a harder question to answer honestly than it appears, because the ego does not announce when it is the one asking to be defended, rather than the genuine interest of the person involved. There is a further dimension to this law that reveals why it belongs among the genuine architectures of power, rather than the tactics of mere passivity. The person who has visibly, consistently, and without evident strategy allowed others, the small wins across a relationship, accumulates something that functions almost like a form of credit. When the genuinely important moment eventually arrives, the moment in which real stakes are on the table, and the outcome actually matters, this accumulated goodwill becomes a form of leverage that no amount of forceful argument could have purchased in the moment itself. People extend deference far more readily to those who have a visible pattern of extending it to them. The person who has spent years insisting on every small point, however, arrives at the important moment already having spent down the very capital that moment most requires, and finds that their correctness, however genuine, is met with a resistance shaped less by the substance of their position and more by the accumulated resentment of every small battle that came before it. This does not mean the wise practitioner of strategic deference has no positions, no preferences, no genuine convictions they intend to hold. It means precisely the opposite. It means they have understood, with real clarity, that the relationship itself is the larger asset, and that protecting it through the graceful surrender of what does not genuinely matter is what makes possible the far more important act of holding firm, with the accumulated support of real goodwill behind them, when something that actually matters is finally at stake. Law 8. The law of the withheld explanation. There is a moment familiar to almost everyone who has ever had to justify a decision, a moment in which a single clear sentence somehow grows, mid-delivery, into 3 sentences, then 5, then an increasingly elaborate structure of context and caveat, and preemptive defense against objections that have not yet been raised. This expansion rarely feels, from the inside, like weakness. It feels like thoroughness, like consideration, like the responsible act of making sure the listener has everything they need to understand the reasoning. And yet, more often than the person doing the explaining realizes, what is actually being communicated beneath the words is something closer to the opposite of authority. It is a quiet signal that the speaker is not entirely certain their position can stand on its own. This is the law of the withheld explanation, and it begins with an observation that runs counter to a great deal of conventional wisdom about communication. Clarity and length are not the same quality, and in fact, past a certain point, they move in opposite directions. The explanation that keeps expanding is very often expanding, not because the listener requires more information, but because the speaker requires more reassurance that the position being stated is legitimate, that it will not be challenged, that enough surrounding justification will preempt any objection before it can be voiced. This impulse is deeply human and rarely conscious. It emerges most reliably in exactly the situations where a person feels, at some level they may not admit even to themselves, that their standing to make the decision in question is not fully secure. Contrast this with the manner in which a person operating from genuine, settled authority typically delivers a decision or a position. The sentence tends to be short. It tends to be delivered once, clearly, and then followed by silence, rather than by an accumulating structure of defense. This is not because the settled person has fewer reasons behind their position. It is because they do not experience the same internal pressure to preemptively win an argument that has not yet been raised. Their legitimacy, in their own mind, does not depend on the listener's immediate agreement, and so there is no urgency to construct a fortress of justification around a single clear statement. If a genuine question follows, it will be answered directly and without defensiveness. At the moment, it is actually asked rather than in anticipation of a challenge that may never come. The listener, for their part, experiences these two deliveries very differently. Even when the underlying content is identical, the over-explained position tends to invite scrutiny precisely because its length signals, however unintentionally, that scrutiny is expected and perhaps warranted. Each additional clause offered in justification reads, to the listener's social instincts, as an admission that the previous clause was not quite sufficient on its own. And this cumulative effect, paradoxically, tends to weaken confidence in the position rather than strengthen it. The brief, clearly stated position, offered without the accompanying architecture of justification, is read instead as something the speaker has already thoroughly considered and settled within themselves, a conclusion arrived at, rather than a case still being actively argued. There is an important distinction to draw here, because this law is easily and sometimes dangerously misapplied by those who mistake curtness for authority. Brevity in the service of genuine confidence is not the same as brevity used to avoid legitimate accountability or to dismiss questions that genuinely deserve a full answer. The law of the withheld explanation is not a license to stonewall real inquiry. It is, more precisely, a discipline of restraint applied specifically to the reflexive, anxiety-driven over-explanation that arises before any question has actually been asked. The practice worth cultivating is not the refusal to explain, but the willingness to state a position once, cleanly, and then to trust the silence that follows rather than rushing to fill it with preemptive defense. If a real question arrives, meet it fully and honestly, but resist the urge to answer objections that exist only in your own anticipation of disapproval, because it is precisely that anticipation, made audible through excess explanation, that teaches the listener to doubt what confident brevity would have taught them to trust. Law 9. The law of emotional containment. Every room carries an emotional temperature, and that temperature, though almost never discussed explicitly, is one of the most consequential variables governing how the people inside it behave toward one another. It rises and falls constantly, shaped by tone of voice, by pace, by the visible tension or ease carried in the bodies present, and most people assume this temperature is simply a background condition, something that happens to a room rather than something actively produced by the people within it. This assumption is largely mistaken. The temperature of any room is, in fact, disproportionately set by whichever person present has the least regulated relationship with their own emotional state in that moment, and understanding this single fact changes, quite fundamentally, how a person who wishes to hold genuine influence learns to conduct themselves under pressure. This is the law of emotional containment, and its underlying mechanism is one of simple contagion. Human beings are, at a level well beneath conscious choice, extraordinarily attuned to the emotional signals of those around them, a sensitivity that likely served important survival functions across evolutionary history, and continues to operate with full force in the modern conference room, the modern dinner table, the modern difficult conversation. When one person in a shared space visibly escalates, whether through raised volume, quickened speech, or the unmistakable physical signs of rising agitation, the nervous systems of everyone else present register this escalation and begin, largely without conscious decision, to calibrate toward it. The room does not remain calm around an escalating person by default. It tends, absent active resistance, to escalate with them. This is precisely why the person who can maintain their own regulation in the presence of another's escalation exercises an influence over the room that has almost nothing to do with the content of anything they say. Their steadiness becomes, in effect, a competing signal, one that offers the rest of the room an alternative temperature to calibrate toward. This is not achieved through the suppression discussed in an earlier law, the visibly effortful holding together that reads, to attentive observers, as its own form of strain. Genuine emotional containment is achieved through a different and more durable mechanism entirely, which is the capacity to feel a strong emotion fully and privately while making a deliberate, unhurried choice about how much of it, if any, will be permitted to shape one's outward behavior in the moment. The physiological reality beneath this composure deserves direct attention, because it explains why this law cannot be faked through willpower alone in the heat of the moment. The body's threat response, once activated, produces measurable and largely involuntary changes: an elevated heart rate, a narrowing of attention, a readiness for confrontation or retreat that operates faster than conscious thought can intervene. The person who appears composed under genuine pressure is very rarely a person whose body has not registered the threat at all. They are, far more often, a person who has developed, through deliberate practice over time, the capacity to notice this activation as it begins and to introduce, in the small gap between the activation and any outward response, a breath, a pause, a moment of genuine choice about what happens next. This gap is trainable. It grows wider with practice and with the accumulated experience of having survived pressure before, without needing to react to it immediately. And it is this trained gap, more than any innate temperament, that separates those who reliably hold the room's temperature from those who are, however unwillingly, swept along by it. The practical application of this law extends beyond moments of direct conflict into the broader texture of how influence accumulates over time. The person known, across a genuine track record of pressured situations, as someone whose presence tends to steady a room rather than destabilize it becomes, without any deliberate campaign to achieve this reputation, someone whose counsel is sought in precisely the moments that matter most. This is not a coincidence of temperament. It is the accumulated, structural consequence of having repeatedly declined to let the room's temperature be set by whatever emotion happened to be loudest in a given moment, choosing instead, again and again, to be the steadier signal the room could calibrate toward when it needed one most. Law 10. The law of the chosen audience. There is an exhausting and largely invisible labor that many people perform continuously without ever naming it. The labor of trying, in some diffuse and unfocused way, to be well regarded by everyone they encounter. This labor rarely announces itself as a distinct project. It operates instead as a kind of background hum, a constant low-level monitoring of how one is being perceived by whoever happens to be present, regardless of whether that person's opinion has any genuine bearing on the life the monitoring individual is actually trying to build. This diffuse monitoring is expensive, both psychologically and strategically, and the person who wishes to hold genuine influence must eventually confront a decision that most people never consciously make, which is the deliberate, disciplined choice of whose opinion is permitted to matter. This is the law of the chosen audience, and it begins with a recognition that will sound, to a mind trained toward universal approval, almost heretical. Not every opinion deserves equal weight in the calculation of how you conduct yourself, and the failure to actively curate whose judgment you are calibrating toward is not humility. It is, more often, a diffusion of attention and energy across an audience so broad that no portion of it receives the genuine consideration it might actually deserve, while the small number of people whose judgment genuinely should matter because they have earned the standing to offer it through demonstrated care, competence, or relevant stake in the outcome, receive no more weight in your internal calculus than the passing opinion of someone with no meaningful connection to your life at all. The practical consequence of failing to make this choice deliberately is a particular kind of drift, one familiar to anyone who has watched a person slowly reshape their decisions, their standards, and even their stated values in response to whichever voice happened to be loudest or most recently encountered. This drift is rarely dramatic. It accumulates through 1,000 small recalibrations, each one reasonable in isolation, until the person doing the recalibrating discovers, often with some genuine distress, that they can no longer clearly articulate what they themselves believe, independent of whoever they last spoke with. This is the cost of an unchosen audience, and it is a cost paid quietly, over years, by people who never made the conscious decision to pay it. The corrective practice begins with an act of genuine, sometimes uncomfortable honesty, the deliberate identification of a small number of people, rarely more than a handful, whose judgment has actually earned a place in your internal deliberations. This earning is not a function of how loudly a person offers their opinion, nor of their proximity, nor even of how much you may wish for their approval. It is a function of demonstrated care for your genuine well-being, combined with genuine relevant insight into the domain in question. The colleague whose feedback on your professional work reflects years of expertise and visible investment in your growth belongs in this chosen audience regarding professional matters. The stranger on the internet whose criticism arrives with neither of these qualities does not, regardless of how sharply the criticism is worded or how much it may sting in the moment it is received. Once this chosen audience has been genuinely identified, a specific discipline becomes possible that is unavailable to the person still operating under diffuse, universal monitoring. The opinions and reactions of everyone outside this deliberately chosen circle can be received when they arrive with a kind of open curiosity rather than reflexive anxiety, precisely because they have been correctly categorized as information that does not carry the weight of genuine authority over your choices. This does not mean dismissing all outside feedback out of hand, since useful insight can arrive from unexpected sources. It means holding that feedback at the appropriate distance, evaluating it on its actual merits, rather than reflexively absorbing it simply because it was offered with confidence or emotional force. The freedom this produces is considerable. The person who has genuinely done this work finds that the exhausting background hum of universal monitoring quiets substantially, replaced by a far more sustainable and far more accurate calibration toward the small number of voices that have actually earned the right to shape how they think about themselves and their decisions. Law 11. The law of the visible standard. People do not, in the great majority of their interactions with you, behave according to some fixed and universal code of conduct. They behave, instead, according to their read of what you personally will tolerate. And this read is formed with remarkable speed, often within the first several exchanges of any new relationship, and then largely maintained unless something occurs to actively revise it. This is a fact about human behavior that carries far more weight than most people give it credit for, because it means that the boundaries within which others treat you are not primarily a function of general politeness or shared cultural norms. They are, to a significant degree, a function of thresholds you have communicated, often without any deliberate intention to communicate them at all, through what you have visibly permitted in the past. This is the law of the visible standard, and its central insight is that every interaction in which a mild overstep goes unaddressed functions, whether intended or not, as a small piece of instruction delivered to the other party about what is acceptable in dealing with you. The colleague who makes a slightly dismissive comment and receives no visible reaction from you has not simply gotten away with a single instance of dismissiveness. They have received a data point suggesting that this category of behavior falls within your tolerated range, and human behavior, calibrated as it constantly is toward the path of least resistance, tends to drift toward the outer edge of whatever range has been demonstrated as tolerated, testing occasionally to see whether that edge can be pushed further still. This mechanism explains a pattern many people experience with genuine confusion: the sense that a particular relationship or dynamic has gradually become more difficult, more disrespectful, or more one-sided over time without any single dramatic moment that could account for the shift. The shift, in cases like this, has very often occurred through exactly this accumulation of small, unaddressed overstepping, each instance minor enough, on its own, to seem not worth raising, but cumulative in their effect, on where the other party's internal sense of the acceptable range has settled. The absence of a visible standard does not produce a neutral outcome. It produces a slow expansion of what the other party believes is permitted. The corrective practice here requires a specific kind of discipline, distinct from confrontation in the dramatic sense, and distinct also from the passive, hoping that a problem will resolve itself if simply ignored long enough. What is required is the willingness to mark a threshold clearly, calmly, and promptly at the moment it is first approached, rather than allowing a pattern to accumulate to the point where addressing it requires a disproportionate and relationship-straining confrontation. This marking does not need to be harsh or even particularly serious in tone. Often the most effective version is remarkably understated. A simple, direct naming of what occurred and a clear, calm indication that it falls outside what you find acceptable, delivered in a manner entirely consistent with the composure discussed in earlier laws. The goal is not to punish the overstep, but to provide the other party with accurate information about where the actual boundary lies. Information they cannot obtain in any other way. Since boundaries that exist only internally, unexpressed, cannot be read by anyone outside the mind holding them. There is a further dimension worth naming, because the law of the visible standard operates in the positive direction as well as the corrective one. What you visibly reward, visibly appreciate, and visibly hold as an admired standard is absorbed by those around you with the same speed and the same durability as what you visibly tolerate in the negative sense. The leader whose visible enthusiasm consistently rewards a particular kind of initiative or care finds that behavior replicated throughout their team, not because it was formally mandated, but because it was demonstrated repeatedly and visibly as the standard that earns genuine recognition. The visible standard, in both its corrective and its aspirational form, is one of the most powerful and most consistently underused instruments available to anyone who wishes to shape the environment around them, rather than simply endure whatever environment forms in the absence of any clearly communicated threshold at all. Law 12. The law of manufactured distance. There is a particular kind of collapse that happens gradually and almost invisibly inside relationships that have grown close without any accompanying attention to boundary, a collapse in which the very closeness that once felt like the relationship's greatest strength becomes, over time, the mechanism through which respect quietly erodes. This is not an inevitable consequence of intimacy itself. Deep closeness and genuine mutual respect are entirely compatible, and indeed the finest relationships available to any human being contain both in full measure. But the two do not automatically accompany one another, and the person who has never examined this particular dynamic often discovers, with real confusion and sometimes real pain, that the people who know them best have, somewhere along the way, stopped treating their positions, their time, and their preferences with the seriousness those things once commanded. This is the law of manufactured distance, and it requires, before anything else, a careful distinction between distance in the cold, withholding sense and distance in the architectural sense this law actually describes. The distance in question here is not emotional coldness. It is the deliberate, ongoing maintenance of certain boundaries, certain areas of privacy, certain forms of formality or self-containment that prevent even the closest relationships from collapsing entirely into a familiarity so total that nothing remains held in reserve. Total familiarity, however warm its origins, tends to produce a specific and well-documented consequence over time, which is a gradual erosion of the small deferences and considerations that closeness, left completely unstructured, tends to dissolve. The partner who is told absolutely everything, who is granted access to every private thought the moment it occurs, who encounters no boundary anywhere in the relationship, does not, as intuition might suggest, experience an ever-deepening reverence for the intimacy this produces. They experience, more often, a gradual flattening of what once felt special about that access, precisely because access without limit ceases to register as access at all, and begins to register instead as simply the ambient condition of the relationship. The architecture required to prevent this collapse is not complicated in its logic, though it is genuinely difficult to maintain in practice, because it runs against the powerful and largely well-intentioned instinct that closeness should mean the complete removal of every boundary as evidence of trust. The healthier and more durable pattern maintains, even within relationships of very deep intimacy, certain deliberately preserved zones whether these are certain private thoughts genuinely reserved rather than compulsively shared, certain standards of consideration and courtesy maintained even in moments of total comfort, or simply a continued, active practice of not allowing the relationship to become the place where the least effort and the least care are habitually offered. This last point deserves particular emphasis because a common and quietly corrosive pattern emerges specifically in the closest relationships, in which a person reserves their most considerate, most patient, most carefully presented self for relative strangers and colleagues, while offering the least regulated, least considerate version of themselves to the people who are, by any honest accounting, most deserving of the opposite treatment. This pattern, left unexamined, produces over time exactly the erosion of respect this law is concerned with, not because the underlying love has diminished, but because the visible standard, discussed in the previous law, has been quietly set at its lowest point, precisely in the relationships that most deserved its highest. The professional application of this law follows a parallel logic and deserves separate attention because the collapse of manufactured distance in professional contexts produces consequences that are, in their own domain, equally significant. The manager who becomes, through excessive informality, functionally indistinguishable from a peer to those they are responsible for guiding, often discovers that their capacity to deliver difficult feedback, to hold a genuine standard, or to make an unpopular but necessary decision has been quietly compromised by the very closeness that once seemed like a strength of the relationship. This does not argue for coldness or artificial hierarchy. It argues for a deliberate, ongoing maintenance of a certain professional architecture, certain forms of consistency and restraint that preserve the capacity to lead even as genuine warmth and genuine care continue to develop alongside it. The skilled practitioner of this law has learned that closeness and the capacity to hold authority are not naturally in tension, but that the specific danger lies in allowing closeness to develop with no accompanying attention at all to the structures that make authority, when it is genuinely needed, still possible to exercise. Law 13. The law of the delayed reward. There is a particular kind of forgetting that happens to anything given too quickly, too easily, or too immediately in response to a request, a forgetting in which the value of what was received seems to dissolve almost as fast as it was granted, leaving behind little of the gratitude or lasting regard that the giver might reasonably have hoped their generosity would produce. This is not a failure of the recipient's character. It is a consistent and well-documented feature of how the human mind processes value, and understanding it changes, quite significantly, how a person who wishes to be remembered, trusted, and genuinely valued over time chooses to distribute what they have to offer. This is the law of the delayed reward, and its underlying psychology rests on a simple but frequently overlooked truth. The perceived value of anything received is shaped not only by the thing itself, but by the process through which it was obtained. And immediate, effortless gratification, however pleasant in the moment it occurs, communicates almost nothing about the genuine worth of what has been granted. The reward that arrives instantly, with no meaningful anticipation preceding it, is processed by the mind of the recipient in a manner closer to an ambient condition than a genuine gift, absorbed quickly and then largely forgotten, because nothing in the manner of its arrival marked it as significant. Contrast this with the psychology of anticipation, a state that, though often experienced as mildly uncomfortable in the moment, does a great deal of quiet work in shaping how the eventual reward will be received. The mind that has waited, that has held a genuine question open, that has experienced some measure of uncertainty about whether and when a particular outcome will arrive, processes the eventual arrival of that outcome very differently than it would have processed the identical outcome delivered instantly. The waiting itself becomes part of the value calculation, and the reward that finally arrives inherits, in the mind of the recipient, a portion of the weight carried by everything that preceded it. This is why an achievement earned slowly, through genuine effort and genuine uncertainty about the outcome, tends to be remembered and treasured far more durably than an identical achievement that arrived without any comparable process, even when the material substance of the two achievements is functionally the same. This law carries direct and significant implications for how a person conducts their relationships, their professional conduct, and their broader presence in the lives of others. The individual who is instantly and unconditionally generous with praise, with access, with reward of every kind, however well-intentioned this generosity may be, often finds, over time, that this praise and access have ceased to carry much weight, precisely because their immediate and unconditional availability has removed the anticipation that would otherwise have marked them as significant. This is not an argument for withholding genuine recognition out of some calculated strategy of scarcity for its own sake. A misapplication that produces resentment rather than the intended effect, much as the misapplication of selective access does. It is rather an argument for a specific and considered discipline, the willingness to let genuine achievement and genuine merit actually accumulate before the recognition arrives, rather than dispensing recognition so freely and so immediately that it loses the capacity to mark anything as truly distinguished. The deeper application of this law extends into the domain of how trust itself is built and how it comes, eventually, to be genuinely valued by those who receive it. The person who extends complete and immediate trust to everyone they meet, with no period of demonstrated reliability required, before that trust is granted in full, often discovers that their trust, once given so readily, is treated with a corresponding lack of care by those who received it, precisely because it arrived without the weight that a more measured process would have conferred upon it. The wiser practice, though it requires a patience that runs against the instinct toward immediate warmth, extends trust incrementally, allowing genuine demonstrated reliability to earn each subsequent increase, and this incremental process produces, in the end, relationships built on a foundation the instantly and fully trusting approach can rarely match. The reward delayed, whether it is trust, recognition, access, or genuine reciprocated regard, is not diminished by the waiting. It is, in the most consistent and well-documented pattern of human psychology, magnified by it, and the person who has genuinely internalized this law finds themselves able to give more meaningfully, precisely because they have learned the discipline of not giving everything away the instant it is asked for. Law 14. The law of the undisclosed reserve. There is a particular quality shared by nearly every figure whose influence has proven durable across years, rather than fading with the first difficult season. A quality that becomes visible only when you know to look for it, and it is this: they are never, in any single interaction or any single season of their public presence, entirely known. Not through secrecy in the evasive or dishonest sense, and not through any calculated performance of mystery for its own sake, but through the simple, consistent, and rarely examined fact that a portion of their capability, their thinking, and their genuine depth remains, at any given moment, unshown. This unshown reserve is not a withholding born of distrust. It is, in its most mature form, the final and most enduring architecture of genuine influence, and it deserves, as the closing principle of this book, the fullest examination of everything that has come before it. This is the law of the undisclosed reserve, and it begins with an observation that runs through nearly every earlier law in this collection, without ever being stated directly until now. Every principle discussed so far, the unclaimed room, the withheld reaction, the long pause, selective access, the borrowed frame, quiet certainty, strategic deference, the withheld explanation, emotional containment, the chosen audience, the visible standard, manufactured distance, and the delayed reward, shares a common thread beneath its individual mechanism. Each of them describes some form of deliberate restraint, some conscious decision not to fully deploy everything available in a given moment, and each restraint, examined closely, produces an effect that full and immediate deployment could never have achieved. The law of the undisclosed reserve is the principle from which all the others ultimately descend, because it names directly what each of the previous 13 laws has, in its own domain, only implied. Full visibility, full immediate deployment of everything you have and everything you are, does not produce greater influence. It produces, with remarkable consistency, less. Consider what it actually means, in practice, to encounter a person who reveals, in any given interaction, only what that interaction genuinely requires, while giving a clear and honest sense, without any explicit claim, that considerably more capability and depth exist beneath what is currently visible. This impression is not created through boasting, which tends to produce skepticism rather than the intended effect, nor through calculated mystery, which tends to produce suspicion when detected as a performance. It is created, more genuinely and more durably, through a simple pattern maintained consistently over time, the pattern of never quite exhausting one's full response to any single situation, of leaving, in nearly every exchange, some evident margin between what has been shown and what evidently could have been shown had the situation demanded it. The listener encountering this pattern repeatedly forms an accurate impression that they are dealing with someone whose visible competence represents a flaw rather than a ceiling, and this impression, once formed, generates a form of respect and a form of anticipation that full and immediate disclosure of everything available could never generate in its place. This law also explains, with unusual clarity, why the fear that drives so much of ordinary social behavior, the fear of appearing insufficient, of not having done enough, of not having said enough to prove one's value in a given moment, is so often counterproductive to the very goal it is trying to achieve. The person operating from this fear tends to overcompensate, deploying everything they have, every credential, every accomplishment, every available argument, in an effort to remove any possible doubt about their sufficiency. But this very overcompensation, this visible emptying of the reserve, tends to produce the opposite of the intended effect, because it leaves nothing held back, nothing to suggest that further depth exists beyond what has already been shown, and an audience that has seen everything a person has to offer in a single sitting rarely walks away with the sense that there is more worth discovering. The person who has, instead, cultivated the discipline of restraint that this book has been describing throughout, who withholds the reaction, who tolerates the pause, who defers the explanation, who maintains the manufactured distance, who delays the reward, arrives naturally, through the accumulated practice of all 13 prior laws, at precisely this final and most enduring quality. They have never shown everything, because they have understood, at a level beneath conscious strategy, that showing everything was never actually the path to being valued in the first place. The invitation this final law extends is not toward secrecy, and it is not toward the cold or calculated withholding of genuine connection from the people who have earned it. It is an invitation toward a different and considerably more sustainable relationship with your own depth, one in which you no longer feel the anxious pull to prove, in every single interaction, the full extent of what you contain. Trust that the depth is real. Trust that it will be discovered, gradually and genuinely, by those who take the time to encounter it across the full arc of a relationship, rather than the compressed urgency of a single moment. And in the space that this trust creates, the space where you are no longer emptying your entire reserve into every room you enter, you will discover the quality that every law in this book has, in its own way, been pointing toward from the very beginning. Not power as performance, not power as volume, not power as the desperate accumulation of proof, but power as a settled, quiet, undisclosed depth that others sense before they can name it, and that no amount of loud insistence could ever have produced in its place.